If you walk through the financial district of London today, you see a city that is one of the banking capitals of the world. It is a place of immense wealth and power, but there is a secret history buried beneath the foundations of this city. There is a story that explains why the British Empire, which once owned a quarter of the globe, collapsed so quickly after the Second World War. We are often told a very specific version of history. We are told that in 1940, Britain stood alone against the darkness of Nazi Germany. We are told that the United States came to the rescue like a generous friend. We are told about the special relationship between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. We are told that the two nations stood shoulder to shoulder to fight for freedom. This is the story we see in movies and read in school books, but it is not the whole truth. There is another story, a colder and harder story about money. It is the story of how the United States did not just enter the war to save Britain, but entered the war to buy Britain. It is the story of the greatest transfer of wealth in recorded history, where the accumulated treasure of 300 years of the British Empire was shipped across the Atlantic Ocean and never came back. It is the story of how Britain pawned its future to pay for its survival. To understand this, we have to go back to the terrifying summer of 1940. The situation in Europe was catastrophic. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British army had barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving all their heavy weapons and tanks on the beaches. The Nazis were standing on the coast of France, looking across the English Channel. They were preparing for an invasion. Britain was desperate. They needed rifles. They needed bullets. They needed steel. They needed food. And most of all, they needed planes. The only country in the world with the industrial capacity to supply them was the United States of America. Winston Churchill turned to President Roosevelt and asked for help. He expected that the Americans would see the threat of Hitler and offer aid freely. But he was wrong. The United States was officially neutral. There was a strong political movement in America that wanted nothing to do with European wars. They remembered the First World War and the debts that were never paid back. They were determined to stay out of this one. The American Congress had passed a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts. The most important clause in these laws was known as cash and carry. It sounded simple, but it was brutal. It said that any warring nation could buy supplies from the United States, but they had to pay in cash up front, and they had to transport the goods in their own ships. There was no credit. There were no loans. There was no charity. If Britain wanted weapons to fight the Nazis, they had to put gold on the table. This created a crisis in London that was just as dangerous as the German bombs. Britain was a wealthy nation, but its wealth was tied up in investments and property in the infrastructure of the empire. It did not have unlimited amounts of liquid gold or US dollars. To buy weapons from American factories, you needed American dollars. You could not pay with British pounds because the pound was losing value, and nobody knew if Britain would still exist in a year. The American suppliers demanded hard currency, so the British government began to hemorrhage money. Every week, millions of dollars were flowing out of the British treasury to pay for shipments of steel and explosives. The rate of spending was unsustainable. By the middle of 1940, the British treasury realized they were running out of cash. They did the math and realized that at the current rate of spending, Britain would be bankrupt by Christmas. If they ran out of dollars, the supplies would stop. If the supplies stopped, the war was lost. Winston Churchill and his cabinet made a secret and desperate decision. They decided to liquidate the wealth of the nation. They decided to gather up all the gold reserves of the Bank of England and ship them to North America. This was a gamble of epic proportions. If the German U-boats found out about these shipments, they could sink the ships. If the ships went down, Britain would lose its ability to fight. They would lose their savings. They would lose everything. This operation was given the code name Operation Fish. It is one of the most remarkable and least known logistical feats of the war. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. It had to be done in total secrecy. Even the sailors on the ships were not told what they were carrying. The gold was stored in the vaults of the Bank of England in London. It was in the form of heavy bars and coins. It had to be moved from London to the ports on the west coast of Scotland and Liverpool. They used armored trains. They worked at night. They loaded the gold into innocent-looking crates. Some of the crates were marked as fish, which is where the operation got its name, but these crates were so heavy that the cranes groaned under the weight. They loaded the gold onto the fastest ships in the Royal Navy, including battleships and cruisers. One of the main ships used was the HMS Emerald. In June 1940, the Emerald sailed from Greenock in Scotland. It was carrying over 130 million pounds worth of gold, bullion, and securities. In today's money, that is billions of dollars. The captain was under strict orders. If the ship was in danger of being captured by the Germans, he was to sink the ship in deep water. It was better to lose the gold to the bottom of the ocean than to let it fall into the hands of Hitler. The journey across the Atlantic was terrifying. The North Atlantic is one of the wildest oceans in the world. The ships faced massive storms with waves crashing over the decks. They had to sail at top speed to outrun the German submarines. They could not use their radios because that would give away their position. They were ghosts in the mist carrying the life savings of an empire. On one voyage, the weather was so bad that the crates of gold stored in the ship's magazines broke loose. Heavy bars of gold were sliding around the decks, smashing into steel bulkheads like missiles. The sailors had to go down into the hold in the middle of a violent storm and try to secure the sliding gold bars before they punched a hole in the hull. It was a physical battle to save the money. When the ships finally arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Canada, the relief was immense. But the operation was not over. The gold had to be unloaded and transported to safety. They used special trains with armed guards to move the gold from the port of Halifax to the Bank of Canada in Ottawa. The sheer volume of the wealth was staggering. There was so much gold that the floor of the Bank of Canada, his vault in Ottawa, actually sagged under the weight. They had to reinforce the building. For the next few years, the capital of Canada held more gold than any other place on earth outside of Fort Knox. But this gold did not stay in the vault. It was there to be spent. It was immediately credited to the British account and used to pay the American bills. But the gold was not enough. The war was costing millions of dollars every single hour. The British government also forced its citizens to hand over their foreign investments. If you were a British citizen and you owned shares in an American company, or if you owned property in New York, you were legally required to sell it and give the dollars to the government. The government would give you British pounds in exchange, but they took the hard currency to pay for the war. This was known as the vesting of securities. It was a massive confiscation of private wealth for the national interest. The British government then sold these assets on the New York Stock Exchange. But because everyone knew Britain was desperate, the American buyers drove a hard bargain. They knew Britain had to sell, so they offered rock-bottom prices. It was a fire sale. One of the most famous examples of this was the sale of the American Vice Coast Corporation. This was a massive company owned by the British firm Courtaulds. It was worth over $100 million. The American government, headed by Franklin Roosevelt, put pressure on the British to sell it to prove that they were truly bankrupt before they would offer any aid. The British were forced to sell the company for just $54 million, about half its true value. The British Treasury officials were furious. They felt they were being robbed by their own allies, but they had no choice. They sold the company and the money was gone in a matter of weeks, buying more planes and more shells. This pattern continued throughout 1940. Britain was stripping itself of every asset it had accumulated over the previous century. They sold their railways in Argentina. They sold their mines in Africa. They sold their shares in American steel mills. They were liquidating the empire to keep the lights on in London. By December of 1940, the situation was critical again. The gold was gone. The private investments were gone. The cash was gone. Lord Lothian, the British ambassador to the United States, landed in New York and spoke to the press. He was a tired man. He looked into the cameras and said simply, "Britain is broke. It was my money, we have no more dollars." This was a shocking admission for the greatest empire on earth. It was a signal to Roosevelt that something had to change. The cash and carry system could no longer work because there was no more cash. Britain needed a lifeline. They needed weapons, but they couldn't pay for them. This is the moment that led to the famous Lend-Lease Act. But before we get to Lend-Lease, we have to understand the price that America extracted for its help. It wasn't just money they wanted. They wanted power, they wanted territory, they wanted the keys to the future. The United States government knew that Britain was desperate. They saw an opportunity to reshape the geopolitical map. Britain had naval bases all over the world, which allowed the Royal Navy to control the oceans. The U.S. wanted access to these strategic locations. So they proposed a deal. It was called the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The U.S. agreed to send 50 old destroyers to Britain. These were ships from the First World War. They were obsolete. They were rusting. They were not the modern ships Britain needed, but they were better than nothing. In exchange for these 50 old ships, Britain had to give the United States 99-year leases on naval bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland and other strategic islands. It was a shockingly lopsided deal. Britain was giving away sovereign territory for a century in exchange for some old boats that were barely seaworthy. Winston Churchill hated the deal. He felt it was humiliating. He felt it was the beginning of the end of the empire. But he signed it. He signed it because he had to. He famously said that he did not become prime minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, but in that moment, he was doing exactly that. He was trading the empire's real estate for its immediate survival. This was the reality of 1940. It was not a time of handshakes and smiles. It was a time of cold, hard negotiation. The British negotiators in Washington were often reduced to tears. They felt that the Americans were taking advantage of their desperation. They felt that the U.S. was deliberately stripping Britain of its wealth to ensure that after the war, Britain would never again be a rival to American economic power. And in many ways, they were right. The transfer of gold and assets in 1940 shifted the financial center of the world from London to New York. Before the war, the British pound sterling was the global reserve currency. It was the money that the world used to trade. By the time the gold had crossed the ocean, the U.S. dollar was king. The vaults in Ottawa and New York were full, and the vaults in London were empty. The physical gold was the anchor of the financial system, and the anchor had moved. But the Americans wanted more than just gold and bases. They wanted technology. Britain was losing the war financially, but scientifically it was still ahead of the world. British scientists had developed incredible technologies in secret to fight the Germans. They had developed radar, which allowed them to see enemy planes in the dark. They had developed the early concepts of the jet engine. They had done groundbreaking work on nuclear physics, which would eventually lead to the atomic bomb. The Americans were behind in many of these areas. So, in the autumn of 1940, another secret mission was launched. It was led by a man named Sir Henry Tizard. It was called the Tizard mission. He traveled to Washington carrying a black metal box. Inside that box were the crown jewels of British military science. He had blueprints, he had prototypes, he had the secrets that Britain had spent years developing. The instructions to Tizard were clear. He was to give it all to the Americans. No conditions, no payments. Just hand it over. The hope was that by sharing these secrets, the Americans would be impressed and would speed up their production of weapons for Britain. When Tizard opened the box in a meeting room in Washington, the American scientists were stunned. They pulled out a device called the cavity magnetron. It was a small copper block that looked like a strange musical instrument. It was the heart of a radar system. It was 1,000 times more powerful than anything the Americans had. One American historian later said that this single object was the most valuable cargo ever brought to the American shores. It allowed the U.S. to leapfrog years of research. They also handed over the designs for the Whittlejet engine. They handed over the research on the atomic bomb, which the Americans would later take and turn into the Manhattan Project. Britain gave away its technological edge. They gave away the industries of the future. They did it because they were broke and they needed a friend. They were buying goodwill with intellectual property. So as 1940 ended, Britain had survived the invasion scare. The Battle of Britain had been won in the air, but the country was a hollow shell. The treasury was empty, the foreign assets were sold, the gold was in America, the bases were leased away, the scientific secrets were shared. Britain was now completely dependent on the United States. It had pawned its future to buy time, and the bill for that time was about to get even bigger. The Americans were preparing a new law called Lend-Lease, which Roosevelt described as lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. It sounded generous. It sounded like a loan of equipment that would be returned. But in reality, it was a complex web of debt and economic conditions that would bind Britain to the U.S. for decades to come. The financial war was just beginning, and the cost of victory would be higher than anyone in London could imagine. The arrival of 1941 marked a new phase in the financial dismantling of the British Empire. The gold was gone. The cash reserves were empty. The private wealth had been confiscated and sold. Now Britain existed entirely on the lifeline of American support. In March 1941, the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. This is one of the most famous pieces of legislation in history. In the public imagination, it is remembered as an act of supreme generosity. President Franklin Roosevelt sold it to the American people with a brilliant metaphor. He said, "If my neighbor, his house is on fire, I do not haggle with him over the price of a garden hose. I lend him the hose, and when the fire's out, he gives it back." It was a comforting story. It made it sound like the U.S. was simply lending tanks and planes that would be returned after the war. But the reality of the contract was far more complex and far more punitive than a borrowed garden hose. The Lend-Lease agreement was not a blank check. It came with strings attached that were designed to permanently weaken Britain's economic position. The American negotiators were not just thinking about defeating Hitler. They were thinking about the post-war world. They wanted to ensure that when the smoke cleared, the United States would be the undisputed economic superpower. One of the key conditions of Lend-Lease was that Britain had to abandon its system of imperial preference. This was a trade system that allowed Britain to trade with its colonies like India, Australia, and Canada with lower tariffs than other countries. It was the economic glue that held the British Empire together. The Americans hated it. They wanted free access to those markets for American companies. They viewed the British Empire as a closed shop that blocked American trade. So they wrote a clause into the Lend-Lease agreement that committed Britain to dismantling these trade barriers after the war. In effect, Britain was signing away the economic structure of its empire in exchange for the weapons to defend it. They were saving the house, but agreeing to knock down the walls. Furthermore, the aid was not free. While the weapons themselves were technically lent, the logistical support and the raw materials and the civilian supplies piled up as a massive debt. The United States kept a detailed ledger of everything that was shipped across the Atlantic. Every tin of Spam, every gallon of oil, every truck tire was recorded. The British officials in Washington tried to argue that their contribution to the war effort should be counted as payment. They argued that British soldiers were dying fighting the common enemy and that London was being bombed. They coined the phrase equality of sacrifice. They believed that British blood should be equal to American dollars. But the American Treasury did not see it that way. To them, business was business. The ledger had to balance. As the war dragged on, the British economy became completely distorted. Britain stopped making cars and fridges and clothes for export. The entire country became a factory for war. They relied on the U.S. for everything else. This meant that Britain lost its export markets. Before the war, Britain was the world's greatest exporter. By 1944, British exports had collapsed by 70%. American companies moved in to fill the gap. While British factories were making Spitfires, American factories were making consumer goods and establishing dominance in South America and Asia. The U.S. was eating Britain's lunch while Britain was fighting for its life. The British government knew this was happening, but they were powerless to stop it. They were trapped in the golden cage of Lend-Lease. Then came the end of the war. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. In London, there were parties in the streets. People danced in Trafalgar Square. But in Washington, the reaction was cold and immediate. The Truman administration, which had taken over after Roosevelt died, abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. On August 21st, 1945, just days after the victory, President Truman signed an order stopping all aid. It was a shock to the British system. The ships that were crossing the Atlantic with food and supplies were literally ordered to turn around. The British economy, which was completely addicted to American aid, went into instant cardiac arrest. Britain was still bankrupt. They had no exports. They had no dollars. And now the free food had stopped. The British government sent the famous economist John Maynard Keynes to Washington to beg for a new loan. Keynes was a brilliant man and a celebrity intellectual. He expected that the Americans would treat Britain with gratitude. He thought they would offer a gift, or at least an interest-free loan to help their ally rebuild. He gave a moving speech about how Britain had fought alone in 1940 and how they had sacrificed their economy for the greater good. He expected the Americans to be moved, but the American negotiators were not moved. They were hard-nosed bankers and politicians who were worried about their own voters. They told Keynes that there would be no gift. There would be a loan, but it would come with interest, and it would come with even more conditions. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was a bitter pill to swallow. The U.S. agreed to lend Britain $3.75 billion. It was a huge sum, but it was less than Keynes had asked for, and the conditions were severe. The Americans demanded that the British pound be made convertible. This meant that anyone holding British pounds could exchange them for U.S. dollars. They wanted to break the British control over their own currency. Keynes warned that this would cause a run on the pound, but he was forced to agree. He signed the deal because the alternative was starvation. When he returned to London, he was exhausted. He died shortly after, largely from the stress of the negotiations. He had fought to save Britain's financial independence, and he knew he had failed. When the convertibility clause went into effect in 1947, exactly what Keynes predicted happened. Countries and investors around the world rushed to sell their British pounds and buy American dollars. The British reserves were drained in weeks. It was a financial catastrophe. Britain had to suspend convertibility and go back to the Americans for more help. The country entered an era of deep austerity. While America was enjoying the post-war boom of the 1950s with big cars and suburban houses, Britain was still rationing bread and meat. Rationing in Britain lasted until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. The children of the victors grew up eating powdered eggs and wearing mended clothes, while the children of the vanquished in West Germany were starting to recover faster thanks to American aid that was better managed. The debt from the war hung over Britain like a dark cloud for decades. The billions of dollars borrowed in 1945 and 46 had to be paid back. Every year, the British government wrote a check to the United States Treasury. In the 1960s and 70s, when the British economy was struggling with strikes and inflation, that annual payment was a painful reminder of the cost of the war. There were times when Britain had to ask for the payments to be deferred because they simply couldn't afford it. The special relationship always looked very different when the bill came due. It wasn't just the money, it was the geopolitical shift. The transfer of the gold and the bases and the technology in the early 1940s was the moment the torch was passed. The British Empire did not collapse just because of independence movements in India or Africa. It collapsed because the bank account was empty. You cannot run a global empire without money. Britain could no longer afford to keep garrisons east of Suez. They could no longer afford to project power. The United States stepped into the vacuum. The U.S. Navy replaced the Royal Navy as the policeman of the world. The U.S. dollar replaced the pound as the currency of trade. The American century began exactly where the British century ended, in the red ink of the Lend-Lease ledger. The final chapter of this story happened much more recently than you might think. For 60 years after the war, Britain quietly paid its installments. Through the Cold War, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, through the rise of the internet, the payments continued. Finally, on December 29, 2006, the British government sent a wire transfer to the U.S. Federal Reserve. It was for roughly $83 million. It was the final payment. The Economic Secretary to the Treasury issued a short statement thanking the U.S. for its support during the war. It was a quiet end to a massive saga. It had taken Britain 61 years to pay off the cost of defeating Hitler. When we look back at the Second World War, we must remember the heroism of the soldiers and the pilots and the civilians. That is real, and it matters. But we must also remember the gold. We must remember the ships sailing through the storms with the wealth of an empire in their holds. We must remember the secret meetings in Washington where islands were traded for destroyers. The gold heist was not a crime in the legal sense. It was a transaction. It was the price of survival. Britain bought its life, but it sold its dominance. The United States did not steal the British Empire. They purchased it. They bought it piece by piece, crate by crate, patent by patent. So the next time you hear politicians talk about the unbreakable bond between the US and the UK, remember that relationships between nations are rarely about friendship. They are about interests. In 1940, Britain had an interest in not being invaded, and America had an interest in becoming the master of the world. Both sides got what they wanted. But the receipt for that transaction is one of the most expensive documents in human history. The gold never came back. The technology sparked the American tech boom. The bases became American outposts, and Britain became an island nation again, rich in history, but poor in the raw power it once took for granted. The war was won, but the invoice took a lifetime to pay. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain why. Either way, history is written by those who argue it. I'll be reading the comments. Thanks for watching.